in this segment, I want to talk about Clausewitz and his theory of war, and that will fit into, in general, our theories of coercion. And so you should have your Clausewitz handout, and I'll be referring to that here. Now, Clausewitz represents kind of a conventional thinking on war. He is often associated with the European model, what they often call the continental model, although a lot of people confuse Clausewitz's ideas of war with those of Prussians, like von Moltke, that will come later. Clausewitz actually is a little bit more free-thinking, if you will, than a lot of the folks that came after him and have been associated with his school. Now, if you ever read on war, this is a book that people always have and they never read. And in fact, really the first chapter is the good part, if you ask me, where he goes in and he gives you his theory of war and he keeps it general. And in that first chapter, Clausewitz kind of lays out his idea of what war is. And then he goes into how theoretically war should be conducted. And then he also talks, well, pragmatically, how does it really work out? So he's got a Hegelian dialectic going on in his reasoning, which confuses a lot of people. Prussian military officers in the 19th century, for instance. So keep in mind that there's kind of a broader interpretation you can put on Clausewitz. Now, Clausewitz says about war that war is an act of force to compel another to do one's will. Okay, so he has very much implicit in here some of the things we were talking about in terms of power. That is, you want someone to do your will. There's a demand you're making on. So we have two actors, the person going to war, the target of the war, and we have this object, the will, what I want this person to do, right? So we're going to try and get them to do their will. Now, I mentioned that Clausewitz has a Hegelian dialectic, and the way this plays out is he goes and he says, well, let's think about, how this war works. And he says, what's the theoretical limitation on violence that can be used if this, in terms of trying to get someone to do our will? And he makes a statement that if the enemy is to be coerced, you must put him in a situation more unpleasant than the sacrifice you call on him to make. Okay, and so this is very important. I think this is significant, and this is going to survive the dialectic, if you will. He's laying out what is actually a necessary condition for coercion to work, that the thing you threaten someone with has to be worse than what you're asking them to do. Right? And I say worse in that presumably they don't want to do what you're asking them to do, or else there wouldn't be a problem. And so, you say, well, I know that's going to be pain for you to do what I want you to do, but let me threaten you with something worse. Okay? And that's basically what Clausewitz is saying. He goes on to say, theoretically, the worst of all conditions a belligerent can find himself in is to be utterly defenseless. So he creates this theoretical object of war. That is, to render your opponent utterly defenseless. Because when someone's defenseless, you can do anything you want to them. You can impose any penalties. You can do anything. And in fact, in the old days, people would take over countries, and they could inflict privations on the population, and retribution. The Romans would decimate populations if they had done something wrong. So, in the history of warfare, when someone becomes defenseless, you can enslave their population, kill all the people. I mean, there's no limit to the violence you can do to them. And whether that's the case today is a different subject. But now, Clausewitz argued that, and I said this was a dialectic, because he said, look, if the worst position you can be in is to be utterly defenseless, then theoretically both sides will be trying to put their opponent in that position. And therefore, war will become, through this interaction, will become this massively violent thing as both sides are trying to destroy each other's army, render the other completely defenseless. And so war will achieve this kind of theoretical extreme of total war, right? That is aimed at the annihilation of the enemy's army. However, he goes on, as part of his dialectic reasoning, to say that's ridiculous. All wars aren't going to be fought that way. I mean, you're not going to fight a major all-out war over small effects. And so he said, so there must be something in reality, since there's nothing in theory, there must be something in reality that will limit the extent to which the war is fought and kind of put a cap on the means employed and direct the war. And he argues that what it is that will limit the war and direct its conduct is the object of the war, what you're fighting over. And this is where he goes on to make the argument that war is policy by another means. And that is to say, he says, look, the political object of the war is going to determine what the military object is. Right? And so, I mean, this is important. He starts distinguishing. He says, look, there's this political object, right? What you want, the objective, what you want the other guy to do. Then you have to come up with some military objective, right? And it's theoretically, it could be the annihilation of the other guy's army. However, if the political object isn't that important, you're going to have a more limited military object. And so you're going to have to come up with a military object that is achievable within, parameterized by the political object, and in some way achieving the military object will get you the political object. Clausewitz likes to say, though, he says, war is a political instrument. The political object is supreme, and it may have to adapt itself to the means that are chosen. Meaning, if your objective is to get somebody to voluntarily do something, or to be amicus with you, to sign a treaty with you, and then you go to war to get them to sign a treaty, well, you may have to give up the amity. There may be things that you have to change in your relationship, because war is a violent means and a risky means of achieving that end. But he says policy is going to have to permeate all military operations, and insofar as their violent nature will admit, it will have a continuous influence on them. And what he's arguing there is that you're trying to achieve the political object. The military object is the means to the end. Okay, and therefore you have to constantly be thinking, all right, what am I doing on the ground? Is that getting me to the final state, the position I want to be in? And what is that position? Well, that position is essentially a bargaining position, where at the end of the day, at the end of the military operations, the political entity will say, hey, this is what we want, and you weren't willing to give it to us before. Have you changed your mind? Right, now that we've invaded your country or invaded your province or done whatever we've done, now would you like to, do what we want you to do? So we'll stop doing these other things. And he actually doesn't talk a lot about it. He just, he mentions the problem you have when there is a gap between your political and your military objective. He says that, if your political object is something that is the same as your military object, say possession of a province. And when we invaded Kuwait to liberate it from the Iraqis, our political objective was to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Our military objective was to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. They'd leave or die or be our prisoner. And that military victory produced a political victory. There was really nothing else we needed. And we went on, however, we did go on to make some other demands. Right, comply with UN sanctions, give up weapons of mass destruction. We had a whole bunch of other things we tacked on after that. And the problem is the military operation didn't achieve those objectives and didn't provide a real good mechanism. And so we had to do something else, no-fly zones, and we'll talk about these kinds of things under coercion. But I think the key thing with Clausewitz and the Clausewitzian view is, one, that he does recognize this idea to coerce somebody, you have to threaten to put them in a position where that's worse than the sacrifice you're calling on them to make. 2, we look and we say, well, here's this traditional view that military victory is this conventional view of war, that military victory is the destruction of the other guy's army. And like I say, the Prussian view always took the view that it was Clausewitz's theoretical extreme. Every war you fight, you destroy the other guy's army, make them powerless to resist, bim, bam, boom, you're done. You win. That's the conventional view of warfare. And it leaves out the second step of, well, when you get done, you got to negotiate. Okay? And so you still have a kind of a bargaining process where you're trying to get somebody to do your will. And as we're going to see when we talk about shelling, that is in fact where a lot of the action and power exists. Clear as mud?